Okay, so we're going to get started today with exercise 125, which is the first of 4 exercises that we're going to be doing. It'll be 125, 126. Then in 127, we're going to take a break, go back to the portfolios. And then we'll go back to SketchUp in 128 and 129. So that's kind of the trajectory of where things are going from here. So with 125, we're going to work through elevation views, or an elevation view. With 126, so next Monday, we're going to work through, I think it's a plan view. And then 127, we'll do portfolio. 128, we'll do sections. 129, we will do perspective views. So the purpose here is to take something that you've modeled in SketchUp, and a lot of you are very fluent in modeling in SketchUp anyway. So using that tool and then transforming it into something that's more usable on a presentation quality document. So we've seen before, and you guys have noticed before, that a SketchUp model is just not that attractive inherently. Like, it never looks that good, no matter how much you do to it. So we're going to try to do some Photoshop work on the SketchUp model to try to enhance it, make it look a little bit better. So I have a model. This was the house that I drew in AutoCAD and subsequently modeled it in SketchUp here. I have it modeled out. It is not complete. If we were to flip around to the back side, it's woefully not developed. But I do have one elevation view. And for the purposes for you guys, what you're creating is one elevation view. So you pick whichever elevation is the most important, and that's the view that you're going to be working with today. Hopefully you've gotten to the point where you have an elevation view to work with. If you haven't gotten there yet, spend 30 minutes or so, try to get that one elevation view done so that you can work with that, that one view. So here I am with my elevation view. Now, as I start to think about this view and I start to look at it, I have to think about what is an elevation view. And we did elevation views in AutoCAD, so it's not like it's a foreign concept of what this elevation view is. But essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the model as if it were an elevation view. But if I come down here and I say, OK, that looks like a pretty good elevation view, there's a fundamental problem. And that problem is that this is still in perspective. It's still in what's called a one-point perspective. If we look at the lines like here on the roof, it recedes back to a point. These lines here recede back to a point. There's a horizon line, and they're all kind of receding toward that point, that vanishing point. So this really isn't a building elevation yet. We need to change this into a flat, non-perspective view. SketchUp and a lot of other 3D programs call this view parallel projection. And so I have it kind of close, what I'm looking at. What I'll do is I'll switch my view first, or it's under camera. Sorry, I always think it's under view. It's under camera. I'm going to go to standard views, and I'm going to work through. It's either going to be the front, back, left, or right view, in all likelihood. I'm guessing, for my purposes, it's going to be the front view, so I'm going to try that one. Nope, I was wrong. Let's go back to camera, standard views. Let's go to the back. There we go. So it was the back view. So this now gets me to the back view, which is nice, but it's still not in that parallel projection mode. So I'm going to go up to my camera again, and I'm going to switch from perspective to parallel projection. It's one above. When I click on parallel projection, my view suddenly looks a lot more like an elevation. There's no more vanishing points. There's no perspective to this view. It's just a flat elevation. That's what we're looking for to create this particular view. So at this point, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. I'm actually going to place my drawing a little bit strategically. I want it kind of in the center, but on the lower third of the page, so it's not centered. There's a little bit more space above, because when I think about this in Photoshop afterward, I want a little bit more sky above my drawing to work with. So I'm going to purposely position this a little bit lower. You can use the hand tool to pan around and move this down just a little bit. I'm roughly centering it in my view here, and roughly having it at about a third of the way down. So there it is. Now, before I do any exports or I do anything, I've got some extra lines happening here. I've got the dotted guidelines, I've got the axes, and what have you. I want those to all go away. So I'm going to go to View, and I'm going to turn off section cuts, axes, and guides. So I'll uncheck section cuts, I'll uncheck axes, and I'll uncheck guides. And so now I should see just a very basic plain elevation view. This looks a lot like the view that I want to start working with in my Photoshop collages. The thing about it is I'm going to be using this view over and over again, and I want it to always be exactly the same view. So before I actually move forward from here and start doing some exports, I'm going to go to my Scenes window. If you don't see it over here on the right side, you can go to Window and then Default Tray and check your scenes. Right there, should be checked. And in the Scenes window here, it's expanded so that we can see it. There it is. I'm going to click the plus icon. And when I click the plus icon, it's going to ask me, do I want to add a scene? And do I want to save it as a new style or update? It makes no difference. Just create the scene. There it is. We get a little tab at the top here that says Scene 1. And the advantage here is if I accidentally orbit, I can always go back to this particular view by double-clicking on it, and SketchUp will take me back to that Scene 1 view. So that's really convenient down the road, because I'll make sure that all my exports happen in this particular view. So there we are. Scene 1, it's saved under my Scenes. Now I'm going to open up the drawer over here for Styles. And my Styles drawer was already open. If yours is not, please expand it. Click the little triangle, point it down. You can also go into your Window Default Tray and make sure that your Styles is checked if you're not seeing it. There it is. Right now I'm showing my default styles. I'm going to change away from the default styles here, and I'm going to go down to straight lines. I think it's under straight lines. No. Is it under? Ah, sorry. My bad. It's under default styles. Under default styles, the furthest one over here, if you have a group of 5, it's called hidden line. That's the style that we're after. And what hidden line does is it gives me just a basic line drawing. There's no line weights to it. There's no thicknesses to it. It's just a basic line drawing. We'll get to the thicknesses a little bit later. Unfortunately, when I click on that hidden line style, it brings back my guides and my axes, so I have to go back up to View. I'm going to turn off section cuts, turn off axes, and turn off guides. There we go. So now I'm back to this view again. Now it's time to do my first export for Photoshop. So I'll go to the File menu, and I'll go to Export, and I'm going to export a 2D graphic. So File, Export, 2D graphic. And I'm going to save this into my folder for today. Let me get there. And today is 125, and this is going to be spring of 2017. I'm off by a year. 2018. There we go. And we're on exercise 125, 2018. And I'm going to add an underscore and then lines to this particular export. So underscore lines. And before I actually export it, I want to click on the Options button. This Options button will give us access to the view size that we're going to be exporting. Usually it's checked for Use View Size, and it gives you a set number of pixels. When we're choosing a view size, we have to think about how large this drawing should really be when we're going to print it. So if I was going to print this on a presentation board, and I wanted the drawing to be, say, 10 inches, if I wanted that 10 inches, I'm going to be printing at 300 dots per inch. So I'd need 300 pixels for every inch that I'd be creating. So in that case, I'd need 3,000 pixels wide. That's for 10 inches. If I wanted it to be 20 inches, I would need 6,000 pixels. SketchUp has a limit of 9,999 pixels in your exports. It's a SketchUp thing. So that's the biggest one we could export. I'm going to go ahead and up my width. I'll do it at 6,000, maybe. Oh, I have to uncheck Use View Size, and then I'll type 6,000. Oops. That was one too many zeros. There we go. And it automatically adjusts the height for me. So I get one or the other. I'm going to make sure that the slider is set over here at best quality, and I'll go ahead and say OK. Everything that I just did here, let me click on the export. There we go. Everything that I just did is written up. If you go to the Digital Tools site, go to Tutorials, and go to Photoshop. Sorry, it's in SketchUp. SketchUp 4.4 Styles for Photoshop. This will walk through everything that I was just doing. Okay? So if you need to go back and reference it, it is there. So I've done my first view. The next view that I want to go through is I want to look at this with the hidden lines turned on. Sometimes this is a valuable view, sometimes it's not. As with all the views that I'm going to be exporting, sometimes they're really worth it, other times they're not really worth it. And so I suggest going through and doing all of these exports and then deciding afterward whether they're really worth it or not. So at this point, I'm going to turn on my X-ray view if SketchUp decides to not crash on me. There we go. So with the hidden line mode selected, I'm going to click on the Edit tab under Styles. So I'm on Select right now. I'm going to switch over to the Edit tab. Here it is. And then I'm going to go to the next option over, which is Face Settings. And with Face Settings selected, I'm going to come over to X-ray. And so in my view, I don't get too much, and you might not even see it. I get an added little line here that shows through my window of what's behind it, and a little bit of detail. It's not helping a whole lot. In some views, it does really help. I'll go ahead and export it anyway. I'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic. Notice I haven't zoomed or changed my view at all. So it's the same view I'm exporting over and over again. And I'll call this one X-ray. And I'll click on Export. The next thing that I want to export is some shadows and to see what this building looks like. Now, this is my north facade, so the shadows aren't going to be that spectacular on it anyway, but we'll give it a shot. So first off, we want to see the shadows. So I'll go up to my View menu, and I'm going to go to View and then Shadows. And that was very underwhelming. And then I also need to look at my shadows in my default tray. I have to make sure that Shadows is checked. And then I'll look at shadows over here. So in this case, I have to change the time of day or the time of year to see the shadows. And why is it not showing up? There we go. Sorry, I was still in X-ray mode. I needed to turn off X-ray mode. My mistake. So with shadows shown, I'm going to change the time of day and or the time of year. Oh, come on. Give me some shadow that I can see. There we go. I'm starting to get a little bit. Like I said, it's there we go. I'm adjusting these sliders to get a little bit of shadow falling on my building. This is my north facade, so it's not the best shadows to begin with. So it's going to vary a little bit. Depends on your overhangs and what have you as to whether you're going to see it or not. So I have my shadows showing. I'm getting them there. But I really don't want to see all the lines. I just want the shadows. We're trying to separate out and tease out these various components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up to my Styles menu here. And I'm going to go over to my Edge settings. So I was on Face Settings. It was this one. I'm moving over one to my Edge settings. And I'm going to turn off my edges. And when I do that, all I get are the shadows. So nothing else. So once again, that's in the Styles tray in the default. Instead of being in the Edge or the Face settings, I'm going to move over into the Edge settings right here. And I'm going to uncheck Edges. And that gives me just the shadows, no lines. I want this where it just has shadows. At this point, I'll go ahead and export it again. I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. And this time it's going to be shadows. And I'll go ahead and export. I don't have to go into the options each time because once I've set them, they're going to stay put with the size of the drawing. OK, so now I'll turn back on my edges. And I'll turn off my shadows. And now it's time to play around a little bit more with the styles. I'm going to go back to the Select styles. Instead of being in the Edit tab, I'm going to go back to the Select tab. And this is where we get to some line weights or some artistic views. And so I'll go into my sketchy edges. And one that I've found that's decent, actually the first one up here, or the second one up here, Airbrush with endpoints, doesn't look that great here in Photoshop, but when you do the export, it ends up being OK. So this is one that I recommend. I'm going to turn on that Airbrush with endpoints, and I'm going to turn off my section planes, my section cuts, and my guides. So let me turn those guys off. Now I have just the elevation view. I'll go to File, and then Export 2D Graphic. And this one is Airbrush. And I'll click Export. The other one that works rather nicely is Pen Gray. You can see if I can scroll down here a little bit more. There's Pen Gray. I'm going to go to my View menu. I'm going to turn off section planes, section cuts, and or guides. There we go. I'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic. And this one is my Pen Gray. And I'll go ahead and export that one. Feel free to look through this list, and if there's one of these styles that feels good to you, that you like, try the export and see if it works for you. Some of them work better than others, but there's no harm in trying and playing around with the various options to try to figure out what looks right and what feels right. This is SketchUp's way of adding some line weights to your drawings. There are other styles available. We could go into straight lines, and we could look at some of the straight lines. These are more just thickening up the lines, but we could go through those. There is a Style Builder competition winners, and I think you can actually find other styles online if you want to. But anyway, you can go through and you can do various other exports. I'm going to stick with the ones that I already did. And at this point, I have all my exports essentially ready, except there may be one more that's useful. And I don't think I wrote this one up, but sometimes it's nice to just have one that's kind of basic color. So let me go back to my default styles. I'll pick one with like a blue sky, something like this, that's very basic colors. And this will just allow me to do some quick selections a little bit later on. So I'll go back to my view. I'm going to turn off the guides and the axes and the section cuts. There we go. And I'll go ahead and export this again. I might even go in and go to Edit and turn off the edges and profiles so that I get just the colors. At that point, I'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic. And we'll call this one Color. I'm not going to use these colors, but it'll help in Photoshop to be able to use them as selection groups. I can select by color range and pick a particular color. OK, so now I have all my SketchUp exports done. It's time to start bringing those into Photoshop. So I'm going to go in and open up Photoshop. And I'll open up that first drawing. So I'll go to File and then Open. And let's go to today's folder. Maybe. Oh, sorry, 125. Wrong number. There we go. And I'm going to start with the first one, which was the lines. There it is. And I'll go ahead and open. So there's my lines view. It's probably a little bit difficult for you guys to see it on the projector. I'm actually going to duplicate the layer and add a multiply on it so that maybe you can see it a little bit better. It'll get better as it goes along. You don't need to do this because you'll see it when it comes in without much issue. You're going to want to take your background layer, right-click on it, and say Layer from Background to unlock the background layer so that it's not it's an editable, workable layer. We don't want to leave it locked. Then I'm going to go to File and then Place, and I'm going to bring in each of these other drawings. And it doesn't really matter which order you bring them in, but we'll want to bring them all in. So there's my X-ray. I'll go to File and then Place. Let's bring in the shadows. go to File and then Place. And I'm going to bring in the pen gray. I'll go to File and then Place. And I'll bring in a color. And I'll go to File and then Place. And I'll bring in the airbrush. So I've brought in each of the views that I saved. But I want these views to start compositing together rather than being one on top of each other. So I'm going to go through, and on each one of these layers, I'm going to take the layer and change the blending mode, which we've done before. If you remember back to that blending mode, it was like the 4th lecture. It was 104 or 105, something like that. I'm going to change that blending mode from normal to multiply. So I'm going to come down into multiply. And what that does, remember, is it makes the white transparent and it makes the black darker. And I'll go through on each one and change to multiply. OK, so now I have them all set to multiply, and we're already seeing this a lot darker. Before we get too far in Photoshop, though, I want to make sure that I go through and kind of correct my various naming schemes on my layers, because they're going to get really heavy with layers. I'm probably going to have 20 or 30 layers by the time this is done. So I want to try to organize a bit. So I'm going to change the name of these. This is X-ray. This is shadows. And I'm just double-clicking on the layer. OK, so I have the ones with the most style. So the airbrush and the pen gray should end up being on top. I'm going to take the color and move it to the very bottom. I have shadows. I have X-ray. Like I said, X-ray doesn't give me a whole lot in this particular case. And I have lines. And I had a second lines. We'll call this lines 2. OK, so I'm relatively organized. That's a good place to start. Let me turn off the color. And let me turn off the shadows for a second. And I'll turn off the airbrush. Can you guys see that OK? Let me turn that on. Yeah, that's dark enough for you guys to see. So I have my basic line drawing right here. This should look a lot like AutoCAD. And the first thing that I need to do is I have to add that ground line. I have to figure out where the ground is and draw that in. And in this case, I have two options. I could, of course, just draw a big, thick line, which is what we did in AutoCAD. Or I could add a little bit more style to the ground, and I could fill it in with a black or a gray or something like that. So let me go ahead and add a new layer. So I'll come over here, and I'm going to click on the New Layer button. There it is. And I'm going to call this Ground. And that ground layer, I want to be at the very top of everything. So it's called Ground. And I'm going to work on that layer. So I'll select ground so that it's selected. And then I need to start by drawing in the ground. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll just draw a rectangular box. I'm using the rectangular marquee tool to draw in that rectangular box. If I want to add to the selection, I can hold down Shift, and I can draw in that direction. And I end up with a selection. This is not the most attractive ground in the world. I think it needs a little bit of slope to it. So I'll go ahead and with my polygonal lasso tool, this one, or excuse me, just the regular lasso tool, I'm going to hold down Shift, again, to add to selection. And you can see that my cursor changes when I hold down Shift. I get the little plus next to it. That means that I can come in here and I can actually draw a little bit of a slope along here and have it vary just a little bit. Maybe like that. Let me add a little bit more right there. And maybe I want to slope down here. I can hold down the Alt key, and it changes. Shift is a plus, Alt is a minus, and I can subtract this from the selection there. I need a little bit more. Okay, so I have a little bit of this slope that's following along my line. Once I have that slope, I'm just going to go ahead and paint that. I'm going to use the paintbrush tool right here, and I'm going to paint it with black. My foreground color is black. My brush size right now is 9, which is really small. Let's make that a little bit bigger. We should see it. I might use the bracket keys to make it even bigger, and then I'll just paint that in black. I'm using black even though it's a really stark color because it's easy to make a transformation to it and change it to gray later. So I'm just going with black for right now. And I've given myself a piece of ground below my drawing. So already this is starting to feel a little bit more grounded, which is a good thing. Now maybe I want to soften that edge just a bit. So again, I'm working on the ground layer right here. I'll come to this edge right along there. Let's come over a little bit. There we go. And still on the ground layer, I'm going to come over and use the clone stamp tool. So there's my clone stamp. I'll click on it. And I'm going to switch my brush to the grass brush, which is number 134 in your brushes. There it is. And with that selected, I may have to adjust the brackets a little bit. I think it needs to shrink down. I'm going to hold down the Alt key to copy from the black, and I'll move up here. It needs to be a little taller. And I'm going to fill in the ground with some grass. Now as I get to the end, so see how it's not continuing, the grass is stopping there? I have to hold down Alt and copy from a little bit further here to finish off the grass there. So I'll continue along with the grass. I'm holding down space to pan, and I'll work my way across the front of the drawing here. And I'm continuing. Notice that the ground layer is not on a multiply. It's just a regular dark layer. And that's why it's on the very top. So it covers up anything that I go over. So as I cover this grass, it's covering up all of those lines at the bottom of my SketchUp drawing. Whoops. OK, so if I press Control 0, we can now see that that ground has in fact a ground to it. It feels like there's ground there. I mentioned before that sometimes you want that ground to be a different color. It's easy to apply an adjustment layer to the ground. I could go in and let me go to my layer, new adjustment layer, and I could just do a levels adjustment. And this levels adjustment, if I change this middle value here, oops, sorry, it's changing everything. Hold on a second. I'm going to tie this to just the ground layer. Control-Alt-G will tie it to just the ground layer. And then let me remember this one. Gotta love it when you try to, there it is. It's that slider. At the very bottom, this black slider, I can change it from gray all the way through to white if I wanted it to be changed. And I'll show you how that makes a difference later on. But I wanted to at least point that out right now. So thus far, I have the elevation view and I have a ground that's been established. The next piece would be to bring in some kind of a background for this particular view. And I need to go find something. So let me go into my Chrome, and I'll go to the Creative Commons image search. And I'm going to look in Flickr for Yosemite Meadow. And a large part of this is finding the right image. And it's not always easy to find the right image. You want to pay attention to light conditions. Where are your shadows? You want to pay attention to how far away is the background. Is there anything in the foreground that's going to interrupt where my elevation view is going to go? And so you kind of have to work through and decide where is an appropriate view. Now, if we were actually working on a real site, we'd be at the site, we'd take the photo, and we'd be able to collage the real photo behind. I gave you guys Yosemite because there's an awful lot of photos that people have taken so that you can search through those photos and pick one that feels like it would be particularly good. So maybe something like this wouldn't be bad. And one of the things that I do as I'm looking for these various views or windows to use or photos to use is I tend to open them. You know, if I find a view that I like, say like that one, I say open in new tab. And so as I keep going, I end up with a collection of views. And I can go back afterwards and say which one of these views is working. Which one feels right, which one looks right. This one might be pretty good. This one might be pretty good with the clouds behind it. I might try this one. This is a new one that I haven't tried before, so we'll give it a shot. The other thing that can happen is I can pick an image and I can decide afterward that, you know what, that was a terrible image, I don't like it. And that's okay too. So don't be afraid to say this doesn't really work. So let me go ahead and download this image. And I'm going to pick the original size, whatever the largest size is. And it's downloaded. I'm going to copy it over into today's folder. So there it is. Let me go ahead and copy it. And then put it into today's folder. There we go. So now I have that image. So let's bring that image into Photoshop. So I'll go to File and then Place. And I'll take that image and we'll drop it into Photoshop. There it is. Showed up a little on the small side. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. Now remember, when I did the export, my pixels were at 6,000. This one was only at 3,000. So it might not be the best collection there. OK, so I'm looking at it here. Obviously, it's not showing my view behind. So I can either change the order of the layers. So I could pull this down a little bit, if it'll let me. No, I'd have to commit to it first. Or I can change this to either have some opacity, like that, so I can kind of look through and see. That might be the easiest strategy. I could also change the blending mode. So I want to pay attention to where's the horizon line in my view, where's the tree line, where's the slope, that sort of thing. So maybe something like that might work. Now I can go back and I can adjust it afterwards. So I'll go ahead and commit to it. I'll click the check mark up here. And now we're seeing that background. If I change this to be fully opaque, I'm going to have to change the order. Let me bring it down to the lines here. But see, the lines are showing up and the ground is obviously showing up, but I need to cut out for my building. So let's go ahead and turn off the color for just a second. And I'm going to work on just the lines layer. And I'm going to use the magic wand to select the background. So right there, I've selected the background or the sky. I'll hold down Shift to add that to the selection as well. So I have the background selected. This looks straight through. That's why I'm selecting it. I'm not selecting any of my windows. We'll get to the windows in a little bit. So I've selected those. Or excuse me, I've selected the background. Now I can go back to my image file. There it is. And I can click on the Add Layer Mask right here. And when I do that, it's going to cut out for my building. And so now, if I did it right, I should be seeing this background image. And I should see my building cut out in white. Now I'm having a little bit of an issue because in this background image, the trees on this side are leaning this way, the trees on this side are leaning that way, which means that the camera that took the shot wasn't exactly, it's a little bit of a fisheye. And so my building would have to have a little bit of a fisheye. So that part's not quite working for me just yet. So I'm going to go back to the image file itself. Let me zoom out a little bit. And I'm going to go into Edit, Transform, and then Skew. And that's going to allow me to correct those trees just a little bit. So we'll correct those trees. Looks like it's skewing my mask, so let's go ahead and delete that mask temporarily. Let me cancel this for a second. Let's delete that mask. We'll create that mask again. I'll go back up to Edit, Transform, Skew, and we'll adjust those trees a little bit more straight. All right, that feels a little bit better. I may have to move those up just a little bit more. About like that, looks pretty good. Okay, now I'll come back and do that selection again. So let me turn off background. I'll use the magic wand on lines 2, select the background, hold down Shift, and select that pass through so that I'm seeing straight through to the outside. And then I'll go ahead and click on the Add Layer Mask. There it is. Oops, sorry, wrong layer. You go on to my photo, there we go, and then Add Layer Mask. So now I'm seeing my building cut out against the background. At this point, I might want to collage on materials or windows, and I'm going to do that for both. It doesn't mean that you have to do all of it. Remember, you guys are always editing what looks best for your particular case. I'm just showing you all the various skill sets. So the first option would be to collage in for the windows. So in this scenario, I could go through and I could select every one of the windows. I'm using the magic wand and holding down Shift. That takes a while, and it can be tedious because there's a lot of windows. So here's an opportunity to use that colored version right there to select all of the windows. And it's hard for you guys to see, but the windows are kind of a light blue, and I'll be able to select them using that color range. So let me go to Select, Color Range. I'll click on the window there, and I'll go ahead and say OK. And it will build a selection out of those windows. Looks like 2 of my windows are a different color for some reason. I'll go to the magic wand, and I'll add those 2 windows to the selection. That was a really quick way of actually selecting the windows. I can turn off the color. And at this point, I need to bring in some kind of an image for those windows, some kind of sky. So I could go to File and then Place, and I could drop in some sky. I think I already have some sky downloaded. Let me go to my flash drive. I tend to keep, under Collage here, I tend to keep a bunch of skies available to make my life a little bit easier. Let's pick something with some clouds in it. Let's go that one. All right, and I'll get those set, maybe like that. Looks like I lost my selection. Let me turn that off again. Turn that one off. Turn my color on. Select Color Range. And I'll say OK. I'll use my magic wand and add this. Oops. Nope, that wasn't what I wanted. Sorry. One more time. Select Color Range. There's that. On the lines layer, I can use my magic wand, hold down Shift, and select those last 2 windows. Go back to my Windows layer, turn that on, and then click on the Add Layer Mask. And so now I'm getting the clouds. Let me turn off the color. Let me turn on the background here. And so we should be getting the, I can turn on the lines as well. There we go. We should be getting clouds as a reflection. The clouds in here have a little bit different blue than the sky color. So I might need to adjust the color of this image. So with that selected, I can go to Image, Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I could change the hue and saturation value, for example. And this is going to be visual, but I can darken up those clouds a little bit to match that blue. So I'm shifting the color just a little bit to make those 2 match. So I have those selected. To me, the windows are still appearing really strong. Actually, all the colors are appearing really strong. So I might take those windows. Let me Control-Alt-G on that so that it's tied to just the windows. And then I might, on the opacity, I might just change that down to like sorry, wrong layer, on the windows. Change that opacity down just to lighten those up. So there's a hint that there's windows, but it's not quite so overpowering. The other thing that may be an option here is I may decide that the background here really doesn't belong in color. Maybe I want that to become more of a black and white. Maybe I want it to fade out or something. So in that case, let me go back to my layer, new adjustment layer. And this time, I'll do a channel mixer, which is how we converted to black and white. Once I create it, I'm going to press Control-Alt-G to tie this layer to that layer only. And then I can go in and switch to monochrome. And I could adjust my presets to decide which one feels right. I could then also maybe up the blue of the windows just a little bit more on my hue and saturation, sorry, my window opacity. Let's up that up a little bit to make the building stand out against the background. So this view by itself is starting to feel a little bit dark. This might be an opportunity to come back to that ground level here and change that ground level to be more gray or even all the way up to white, because that might help it all blend together. So you have to decide what's the right strategy for what looks good. And so maybe it's gray, maybe it's white. Sorry, I need the black one here. Maybe it's a gray value, and maybe it in fact is black. You have to kind of sort through that strategy. I could collage in concrete as a material if I wanted to do that as well. It's the same process. I'd have to find an image of concrete. So I could go back to my Creative Commons search here, and I could say concrete. Let me go back to actual Creative Commons, search.creativecommons.org. Ideally, it would be a tiling, so I can repeat it. And I can say, oh, I kind of like this texture. That looks pretty good. Let me download that one. Let me show it. Let me go ahead and copy it. And I'll go to my flash drive, or in this case, my OneDrive. And I'll go into today's folder. And I could paste that in as well. There it is. I can come back to my view here. Let's turn some stuff off. Let's get back to just the lines. Turn the ground off too. And in this instance, working with the color view might help. I can go up to my select color range, and I'm not picking the windows this time. I'm actually picking the white. And when I do that, I can get all of the concrete in one selection. Oops. Sorry. Wrong layer selected here. Select color range. There it is, the white. Now it's made my selection. Oh, I should have brought in the image first. Let me go to File and then Place and bring in that image that I just saved. There's my concrete. This one needs to repeat over and over again. So I have my first version of it. I'll commit to it. Then I'll copy it. So I'll make a selection around it. Doesn't have to be precise. Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. And then I'll use the Move tool to align these two up. They should snap together rather easily. There we go. And I'll keep pasting these in place. Need another one up there. We'll work our way backwards across the bottom. One more. There you go. Now, one of the problems with bringing in a tiling texture like that is look at what happened to my layers. I ended up with a bunch of layers there. I can actually take the first concrete all the way up to layer 13, which is the number of copies it took. So it took 14 total images. I can combine all of those together. I can go to the layer menu and I can say merge layers. And that makes one layer. I'll call this one concrete. And then once again, I have to go back to that selection. So I'll go back to select color range. Oops, let me be on the lines layer. Select color range. I want just the white. There we go. Then I'll go to my concrete layer and I'll say add layer mask. That was concrete layer, add layer mask. There we go. And so now I get the concrete tiled in as well. Let me turn off the color. Press Control 0 so we can see the whole thing. And then it's time to start turning back on layers. So I'll turn back on my lines. I'll turn back on my windows. I'll turn back on my background. I'll turn back on the black and white of the background. And I'll work my way up and turn on the ground itself. So I'm starting to really see this drawing come together, but I need a little bit more line weight. The color's a little bit too dominant. So this is where these styles come into play. So I'll turn on the airbrush and take a look at what the airbrush looks like. That really darkens up the lines quite a bit. The pen gray might not do as much. That would be the pen gray if you want a little bit more subtle look. Or one of the other options might be the best strategy. Remember, if the airbrush is too much, for example, I could go up to the opacity and I could drop the opacity down so that it's not quite so intense. If you need more of the lines, you could always duplicate the layer and add a multiply. That'll make the lines a little bit darker. So the last thing that I didn't work with was the shadows. I'm just going to turn them on, and it looks like they're showing up just fine. They were already a multiply layer, so it's working out OK. The shadows do need to be toward the top of the layer stack, though, so that they show up on top of your background images, your sky, etc. So this was an example of how to create an elevation view of your building. It ends up being a little bit more collage than a true elevation. The AutoCAD true elevation is just a line drawing, and we don't do too much. The Illustrator work on top of a line drawing tends to do with just the building, maybe some materials on the building. This is a little bit more about the environment and what it feels like to be here. This ends up, however, being a really good way of showing your designs on a poster or on a big board. So it can work out really nicely. And I would argue that this looks a lot different than the original SketchUp or anything that would come out of SketchUp, even if you were rendering it. So the goal here is to de-SketchUpify. There we go. There's a new word for you. De-SketchUpify. I like that word. So you're going to de-SketchUpify your drawings. I'm going to keep saying that all day. I'm happy about that. You're going to do that to your drawing to get a nice elevation view that looks something along these lines. Remember to edit. If the colors are too much, if the black and white background is too strong, take the background, adjust the opacity down so it becomes less, so that your building stands out against it more. Be creative about it. That's acceptable. Okay? So I'm going to turn you guys loose, work through this today. Like I said, next class we're going to continue working, doing the same process. We're going to do plans instead of doing elevations, but it's the same general idea. We'll take SketchUp, we'll work with it, we'll do our exports, then we'll come into Photoshop and we'll do the collage. So this will be repetitive. Any questions before I stop?
Well, I like for the concrete, when you did it like a different way last time. It's not like all layers. You did it, right?
So the last time I did the tiling was in Illustrator. So it's different. Photoshop works differently. So I switched from Illustrator to Photoshop. The one key thing that actually a lot of you guys asked me about in the last round is why are we doing this in Illustrator versus I could just do it in Photoshop. And so here we are doing the elevation view in Photoshop. So we've done the elevation view in Illustrator. We've done it in Photoshop. The difference here is that this export from SketchUp is not at scale. I can't say this is a 1/4 inch equals a foot or an 1/8 inch equals a foot. It's just a pretty image. I can make this as big or as small as I wanted it to be. So I did talk about it needs to be 300 pixels per inch to print. That's just so that it turns out clear. It has nothing to do with the actual scale of your drawing. If I were to zoom in a little bit more in SketchUp, my elevation view would be a little bit bigger, and it could still be 6,000 pixels. So there's no way of, without actually measuring and working through some scale calculations, there's no way of actually knowing what scale this is. It's really just a pretty picture. So if we were going to do multiple views of this, we collaged and we worked in this in SketchUp and then in Photoshop, and they were going to go on a board, we'd want to make sure certain things are the same. Like when we go to print, the heights are all the same, or the widths of the building are all the same. I couldn't tell you what scale it is, but we want visually for them to look that way. So that's the big difference between collaging in Illustrator versus collaging in Photoshop. And you just have to be really aware of that difference. But Photoshop can be a lot easier to do the collage work. So get one, lose the other. But good question. Any other questions? No? All right. I'll turn you guys loose. And we'll touch base again next week.